So hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today, wherever you might be in the world. My name is Seth Joyner, and I'm the program manager for the National Committee on North Korea, and I'm happy to introduce today's webinar on the recent South Korean legislative election and its implications for the future. For those of you new to our organization, NCNK is an NGO working to promote peace and security on the Korean Peninsula and to improve the lives of the North Korean people. NCNK is a non-governmental, nonpartisan organization whose membership reflects a broad range of perspectives and subject matter experts related to North Korea. NCNK serves to share information among its members, advance their work, and provide the broader public with substantive and balanced information about North Korea. It's my pleasure to introduce today our moderator, Scott Snyder. A little bit more about his background. Scott serves as president and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute of America, where he leads research and programming on Korean affairs and U.S.-Korea relations. Before KEIA, Scott was senior fellow for Korea Studies and director of the program on U.S.-Korea policy at the Council on Foreign Relations from 2008 to 2011. Prior to joining CFR, Snyder was a senior associate in the International Relations Program of the Asia Foundation, where he founded and directed the Center on U.S.-Korea Policy and served as the Asia Foundation's representative in Korea between 2000 and 2004. With that said, a few more notes of housekeeping before we begin. This event is being recorded. Please do not take screenshots of today's event. Thank you so much for cooperating there. And if you, as an audience member, have a question, there'll be time for you to put your questions in Zoom's Q&A function. We'll get to answering as many questions as possible towards the end of today's program. Now, it's my pleasure again to turn it over to Scott to both introduce our guest speakers, Duyeon Kim and Andrew Yeol, who we're very pleased to have with us today, and to hopefully jump into what will be, I'm sure, a insightful discussion. Over to you, Scott.
Thank you, Seth, and I want to welcome everybody who is joining us for this discussion. I'm going to begin by just giving a little bit of a summary of where things stand and then introduce our two expert panelists. We're about 5 days away from South Korea's legislative elections of April 10th. And we know that result was a setback for the Yoon administration as the opposition Democratic Party captured 175 seats compared to 108 for the ruling People's Power Party in the 300-person unicameral National Assembly. There's an additional 12 seats that went to a new party, the Choguk Reform Party, which is aligned with the Democratic Party. So the result represents a slight drop from 114 to 108 for the ruling party. We know that the voting rate was over 67%, which is the highest in over 30 years. And clearly the result means that the Yoon administration is going to struggle to gain the legislative support necessary to pursue a number of domestic reforms in labor, education, and pensions that it had hoped to implement, and that the president is going to face demands for compromise with the opposition party to pursue legislative support for major domestic initiatives. On the other hand, the Yoon administration has pursued major foreign policy initiatives during the past 2 years without significant hindrance from the National Assembly, and we'll discuss whether these initiatives can and will continue. And then finally, in addition to serving as a midterm referendum on the performance of the Yoon administration, the election also serves as an early backdrop, a very early backdrop, shaping the political landscape for South Korea's next presidential election, which is 3 years away, and of course that means several lifetimes in Korean politics. And so here today to discuss the results of the election and its implications, we have two very distinguished analysts. First is Andrew Yeol, a senior fellow and the SK Korea Foundation chair at the Brookings Institution's Center for Asia Policy Studies. He's also a professor of politics at the Catholic University of America here in Washington. And he is the author of State, Society, and Markets in North Korea. He has written widely for many publications and is very well known as an analyst on Korean affairs. Duyeon Kim is an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for New American Security and a columnist with the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. She's also a visiting senior research fellow based in Seoul at the Korean Peninsula Future Forum, founded by the former National Security Advisor Chun Young-woo. And she is widely known as a specialist on nuclear nonproliferation, especially as related to the two Koreas, and has worked previously with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and at the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation. Welcome to both of you. We're looking forward to a very good conversation. And I want to start just with where we are, and that is, how do you, I'm going to start with Andrew and then go to Duyeon. How do you assess the impact of the election, and what are your main takeaways from the National Assembly election and what the South Korean public was trying to, what message was the South Korean public trying to send to its political leadership?
Well, good morning to you, Scott, and thanks to NCNK for organizing this event. And I should say good evening to Duyeon, who's on the other side of the world with us. And thank you for that readout of the South Korean elections. I know we're now 5 days out, but we're still trying to process what's happened. But the biggest message, of course, is that this was seen as a referendum for President Yoon and a rebuke of his administration and also his party, the People Power Party. The second thing is that's on a lot of people's mind is whether we're going to see just complete gridlock. Now, on one hand, I want to say, maybe things may not be all that much different. The National Assembly is still controlled by the opposition Democratic Party. So there was gridlock before. And when it comes to foreign policy, of course, President Yoon was willing and he was able to some degree plow through his preferred policies because he can set the agenda on foreign policy. So on one hand, one could argue that maybe not a whole lot will change, but on the other hand, I think this does create a new political dynamic. There's now a third party. You mentioned Choguk's his Rebuilding Korea party, and there is some pressure maybe for Yoon to perhaps work together with, or at least make some sort of compromise so that legislation can get passed domestically. So yeah, there's I think again we're still processing how this plays out, but for me, I think we're going to actually see more polarization. We've already seen accusations and threats that the opposition is going to launch investigations, and this isn't the way to begin a new era of compromise. But of course, I think the opposition feels emboldened at this point. But yeah, I'll pass it back over to you, Scott.
Okay, and Duyeon, I have the same question for you. What are your main takeaways?
Right. Well, first, thanks so much to NCNK for having me, and of course, hello to both Scott and Andrew. I'm actually in Sydney right now and not in Seoul. I'm speaking here on Indo-Pacific security, but it's a pleasure to be here. So, I think first, I echo a lot of what Andrew has already said. For me, of course, the opposition has retained its majority in the National Assembly. But if we look at the actual percentage of votes, they won by 5%. And so I connect this to Scott, your earlier point about this election being an early backdrop of the next presidential election in 2027. So I think it's an early indicator that if things remain the same as they are today in 2027, that it will most likely be a very tight race. But of course, there's so many variables, and it's 3 years is an attorney in politics, and so anything can happen and change until then. But it's clear that the South Korean people, voiced their opinion and their assessment on Yoon's presidency and governance midterm. And so I think this might have been a big wake-up call for him, despite his good intentions of wanting to pursue and achieve a domestic a liberal democratic agenda at home. He has faced many challenges politically, but also economically. And so right now, with the opposition being holding majority seats in the National Assembly, I think his domestic agenda will be the most challenging for him to achieve, especially on economic policies, on market reform policies, on tax reform policies. And so this is where he will have to find a way, whether it is to build more consensus or whether it is on compromising with the opposition. He's going to have to find a way to really try to achieve and achieve his campaign pledges, but also the policies that he has pledged to implement, the domestic policies he has pledged to implement during his 5-year term. A lot of viewers or observers from the outside, of course, any country's domestic politics is a bit too much, too detailed and too much in the weeds for them. But this general election was actually is meaningful and significant because whichever party wins, which right now is the Progressive Party, has a direct impact on President Yoon's domestic policies, and will be able to implement them or not for the remainder of his term. And his approval rating going forward from now until 2027 will have a direct impact on the outcome of the next presidential election in 2027, because it would give voters an indication of how a next conservative party may or may not govern if a candidate from the conservative base is elected president. And so a lot is there's a lot at stake for the Yoon in the next 3 years.
Thanks, Duyeon. One of the things that I'm noticing in the Korean media, and especially editorial pages, and by the way, I think that this is very predictable, is calls for President Yoon to engage in compromise as a way of getting through a domestic agenda, and also some criticisms as related to his governing style, which both of you mentioned, and some exit polling that I saw referenced indicated that the highest level of frustration went with the economy and people's livelihood. Second is perception of Yoon's dogmatism and one-sidedness, quote unquote. And a third is poor communication or one-way communication. So in light of those criticisms, and given the majority in the National Assembly for the opposition, what pathway do you think that President Yoon is likely to follow, especially dealing with domestic issues? Do you think that he's likely to try to continue to just use executive authority in order to push through his own agenda, or do you think that he will be able to find a way to establish a modus vivendi involving compromise? The environment is just so deeply domestically polarized. I'm wondering, how you think that President Yoon, what are his real choices in terms of room for maneuver as he pursues his domestic agenda? Start with Andrew.
Sure, that's a really fascinating question. And of those on the exit polling, I mean, the first issue was really just the state of social economic issues, high inflation, falling birth rates, job security. But then the other two really have to do with Yoon's own personality, and there's been a lot of critique that he kind of operates in a way that's very clubby. It's either my way or the highway, and he sort of barrels through on things. I mean, he goes with his intuition, and there isn't a lot of a consensus. And so the question is, on those two issues that are more personal to him, is he willing to take on more humility and perhaps reach out to the opposition? And so one headline I saw was that he actually admitted that that it was a defeat, and I don't know if he made an apology. I don't know if you picked up on that, Scott or Duyeon, but the fact that he recognized that there needs to be something needs to change within his party, I think that's a start. But whether he'll move forward with that, that's just not against his style. It's hard to see. I think that he would continue to press with the using executive authority, but there may be some areas where he could compromise that the opposition may be interested in. So issues that might relate more to national security. If there's any kind of legislation that can strengthen South Korea's things like supply chain security, things that could enhance a South Korean company in the global market. I think that might be some place where they could find some compromise with the opposition. They both, both the opposition and the ruling party recognize common problems that face Koreans as a whole, like falling birth rates. If there's a way to work together to come up with some sort of plan that can improve, that can provide better subsidies. I mean, I know the PPP, the ruling party has proposed legislation, but there might be ways where they could work together. But I do think that part of it may be the posture that Yoon takes going forward. I'm sure within the presidential office, within the party headquarters, there's a lot of conversations now about how best to move forward.
And Duyeon?
Yeah, so your question is a tough one to predict with any degree of certainty at this point right now, because it really depends, and some of this echoes what Andrew said, but it really depends on the president's own realization and what he believes is the right way forward, and however he defines what the right path is. So if we look at the past couple of years and his style and his personality, I think we can expect some continuity, but at the same time, this election result, did it actually, give him enough wake-up call to try to adjust, whether, especially if it's on things like, communicating better with the public, or not barreling through and not taking more, I guess, so-called unilateral steps, but actually building more consensus. And those last two, they're not necessarily compromising with the opposition. Those last two issues are criticisms that even came from his own support base or conservatives. And so I think it really remains to be seen what his personal choice is going forward in terms of his governance style. On the first one, on economic issues, this is one that, of course, is there have been criticisms from both sides of the aisle, but this is also very contentious, especially when it comes to the opposition, when it comes to things like his tax reform policies or other economic policies. And so that's an area where frankly, it's really hard to predict with absolute certainty which issues he will give into or compromise, or which issues he will decide to scrap just to shore up more public approval. And so going forward, it also depends on going back to my point about what he defines as the right way forward. Will he? There are more questions than answers here. Like, will he be wary of party politics and constituents, and trying to, and will he be thinking about the next presidential election and trying to set up the country so that the conservatives can win again next time? Or will he just see his 5-year term as just being his own and want to leave behind his own legacy and not take into consideration too much other views? And these are all just questions. And so I bring up this question because he is not a typical party man. He was not a political before he entered office. And so these are still questions that remain to be answered. And it's really, I think this is a question that, Scott, you should be posing to President Yoon, because he would actually be able to be in a better position to answer them. But again, more questions that need to be answered about how he's going to govern going forward.
Thank you. Both of those, I think, answers were very illuminating and highlighted different aspects of the challenge. I do have one kind of in the weeds question that I want to ask to both of you, and that is the media discussion of the election result very much focused on the 2/3 threshold that the opposition party did not reach, precisely because it would mean that the National Assembly could potentially pursue some kind of impeachment motion or something like that. On the other hand, there has been legislation that has been passed by the National Assembly, even before this election, that President Yoon has vetoed. But what I don't know about is whether or not the National Assembly has a veto override capability and what the threshold for that is. And so if either of you have the answer to that kind of in the weeds mechanics question of the Korean political process, that would be very useful.
Yeah, so if I can answer first, so technically there is a system where if the president vetoes a bill, then it gets returned to the National Assembly for a second vote. And the second voting requires approval from 2/3 of attending lawmakers. And so this is where, for example, there are two bills right now that are highly contentious, and one is a proposal to set up a special counsel investigation into the death of a Marine last year, and another bill was introduced last month to investigate then Defense Minister Lee Jong-suk that was supposedly involved or not involved in that incident. And so these two bills, for example, if we just take this as a real life example, if the president vetoes a bill, then it goes back down to the assembly. But the bill does not technically need any vote support from the ruling party to pass, but it would need ruling party votes to override a presidential veto. And so this is where it's going to get very interesting, because we've heard through the news that certain conservative party lawmakers, a couple have said to the press that in principle, there's no reason for them to oppose a special counsel investigation, for example. And so, this is where it could get a bit tricky. And so, we're hearing that the opposition wants to try to get these two bills passed before the next National Assembly, the new National Assembly that starts late May. So the ones that have recently been elected this time, they actually start their work around late May-ish, but they have about 1.5 months left. And so technically there is that mechanism to answer your question, Scott, but the opposition right now does not have 2/3 of the seats that is needed.
Okay, so the 2/3 threshold remains the critical mark for that.
Yes, and so in that sense, these two bills, if we use this as an example, they could either be completely scrapped if the president vetoes the bills.
And Andrew, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I mean, as Duyeon, I think, explained it quite clearly, you need the 2/3 majority. And I mean, it is possible that there could be other conservative parties that aren't part of the ruling PPP, that if they want to threaten you, or if they're just unhappy with him, that they might align with the opposition, and then a certain legislation can get passed. But that would be very difficult.
Okay. I want to switch over to foreign policy, because that's what the rest of the world is probably most interested in. And actually, the way I want to frame the discussion of foreign policy, as I've been thinking about this National Assembly results, it actually reminds me a lot of the Kim Dae-jung administration and that administration's experience facing an opposition-led National Assembly back in April of 2000, I was actually in Seoul at that time for the election. And of course, that election occurred only 2 months prior to the Inter-Korean Summit, the first Inter-Korean Summit. And so in that case, I guess what was really notable is that Kim Dae-jung was able to pursue foreign policy almost without regard for what was going on domestically in the National Assembly. And I wonder if that is also the case for President Yoon. And of course, the three issues I really want to focus on are the relationship with the United States, the relationship with Japan, and the relationship with North Korea. But maybe we can start with the US and whether or not you see any areas of constraint or ways in which the National Assembly would be able to impede the Yoon administration's efforts to strengthen the relationship with the United States. Andrew, why don't you start?
Sure. So, I do see that the basic contours of Yoon's foreign and national security policy, including support for the U.S.-South Korea alliance, will persist. In some ways, and I think you've mentioned this before, Scott, that U.S.-South Korea alliance, which in the past may have been a politicized issue, has been depoliticized just because there's wide public support, even among progressives, for the U.S.-South Korea alliance. So for the time, it's fine to continue to strengthen the alliance. Now, I think the biggest variable is actually not what happens in South Korea politics, but in U.S. politics come November, and who enters the White, if it's a second Biden administration, or if former President Donald Trump returns to the White House. I think that could shake things up. But as it stands, I think that this will be less of a contentious issue.
So to add to what Andrew has mentioned, fundamentally, South Korea's foreign policies do not require National Assembly approval, except for trade deals. And so in that sense, a South Korean president has a lot of executive powers to push for whatever foreign policy he or she sees fit. If we look at President Yoon's personal style, I think we can expect him to want to barrel through. I'm using Andrew's word. I used to say the word bulldoze through in the media to some outlets, but to just really accelerate the foreign policy initiatives that he has already started, especially when it comes to strengthening alliance relationship with the United States, improving relations with Japan. And of course, strengthening the trilateral relationship, U.S., Japan, South Korea on many issues across the board. And so, I think it's safe to assume that his foreign policies will not change, but rather than the opposition becoming a potential factor, I think, if he does slow down some of his foreign policies, or if he does take a more cautious stance, one factor or one variable could be if it really depends on the bureaucracy to continue to implement his foreign policies at the same level as they have been right now. And why the reason why I bring up the bureaucrats is because if they feel that the domestic political environment is unstable until 2027, so the entire country from today on out, they're all going to be focused on the next presidential election. Even Yoon's own party is going to be squarely focused on preparing for the next presidential election. So if the entire country across the board is focused on that, then there is a possibility, I'm not saying that it's going to happen, but there might be a possibility that the bureaucrats the worker bees that need to implement these policies, if they feel that the political environment is unstable, then and if the National Assembly cuts budgets, for example, and making it more difficult for the bureaucrats to work, that those might be some variables in the equation. But again, it really remains to be seen. But but circling back, and I think this is something that I agree with Andrew on, is I think so far unless there are other factors that emerge that we cannot foresee right now. If all things stay the same, then I think we can expect President Yoon to want to accelerate his foreign policy initiatives.
Thank you. And I do want to, we are going to turn to the audience for questions. I'm going to ask two more questions, one about Japan and one about North Korea. But I do want our attendees to be prepared with some additional questions. And so you can either put those in the chat or signal that you have a question, raise your hand. With regards to the relationship with Japan, that actually, I believe, has been politically contested within South Korea. Certainly, the opposition has raised that as an issue of criticism. And I also noticed that, Cho Guk, the leader of the small party, he made some comments on social media back in the previous administration that really suggested that an anti-Japan position was patriotic. And so it directly, I think, conflicts actively with the Yoon administration's approach. How do you expect potential opposition to Yoon's policy toward Japan to show itself in this context? Or do you think that it's really a matter of President Yoon just pushing forward and getting as much done as he can in that relationship?
Yeah, well, let me take that one first. So as we've been saying, I think foreign policy is the safe space for President Yoon. But if there's one issue, I think where he might get some trouble from the opposition, it's on issues with Japan. And to date, we've seen President Yoon, despite strong domestic opposition and pushing forward rapprochement with Japan, that he was still willing to do it anyway. So some might argue that, well, it doesn't really matter. The opposition position isn't going to change, and neither is President Yoon's. But I do think that there could be more of a threat from the opposition. The Democratic Party of Korea may feel more emboldened. And I think one complication is that I think for Yoon to be able to continue moving forward with relations with Japan is that the opposition is going to want to see Japan first give further, make some kind of concession or related to historical grievances. So some of these historical issues that were maybe glossed over as rapprochement was getting underway between the Yoon government and Prime Minister Kishida is that there was an expectation that Japan would somehow reciprocate further. There were steps taken. Yoon was invited to the G7 meeting in Hiroshima. The two leaders visited a park that showed and stopped by a memorial where Korean victims of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were commemorated. So there were these, I think, symbolic steps, but I think there was an expectation that Japanese companies or perhaps even the government might contribute to the fund that the Korean government had established on compensating, for instance, Korean wartime laborers that were first forced to work in Japanese companies. But those steps didn't happen. And so I think if rapprochement were to move ahead further, I think the opposition is going to really push the Yoon government to insist on that. And since we're talking about Japan, we also think about the U.S., Japan, Korea trilateral. I think that will continue moving forward. The wheels are already in motion with the Camp David deliverables. So it's not as easy to reverse. But of course, if bilateral relations between Japan and Korea slow down, if the winds to the sail stop blowing, then over time, I think even U.S.-Japan Korea relations may also slow down in pace as well.
Okay, Duyeon, I'm going to give you a little bit of a twist on this because
Okay.
Andrew has raised this issue of reciprocation, and I do think that it's interesting that President Yoon took action to normalize the relationship at a time when he had maybe a little bit more political momentum, Prime Minister Kishida was in a position of political weakness. Reciprocation, one precondition for reciprocation might be if President Yoon is in a position of political weakness, but I don't yet see Prime Minister Kishida gaining political strength. So how do you think that that's likely to play out? In
So
addition to the other comments that you were already prepared to make and that I so
yeah,
rudely interrupted.
yeah, these are great questions. I think the trilateral, again, this is where I agree with Andrew. It will continue, and there's so much work left to be done there. Much more to go. They've just outlined the contours, very comprehensive contours, but they've outlined them. And I do agree with Andrew that it's going to be difficult to slow that down or reverse the trilateral cooperation. I think the main area where things could get dicey with the opposition, well, basically the opposition I think will create noise regardless, because the far left, we all know, has anti-Japanese sentiment, and so whatever the Yoon government does with Japan, the opposition, especially the far left, is not going to like it. But if things were to get dicey, then it could be if South Korea and Japan decide to forge some new agreement or embark on a new initiative, a bilateral initiative that is extremely politically sensitive. Whether it's some sort of security agreement, a bilateral security agreement, for example. But I just don't. Putting aside, short of any unexpected variables that may emerge from here on until 2027, I just don't see a practical way in which the opposition could get in the way of the Yoon government, or especially President Yoon's desire to continue to improve the relationship with Japan, because it's not purely a bilateral improvement that he's thinking. He's putting into the context of trilateral and regional and Indo-Pacific security, and so in that sense, it's hard for me to see right now, today, any real practical way for the opposition to get in the way of that.
Okay.
Unless the opposition tries to make this into a presidential issue, election issue. So if we get closer to 2027, if the opposition decides to make this an issue during the presidential campaign, then that might be a factor or a variable. But in the most recent few years, we just haven't seen foreign policy become a decisive issue for voters in South Korea.
I appreciate that. The last question that I have, and we are gathering a number of questions, so I want to try to move relatively quickly on this. But my simple question on North Korea is, what do you think Kim Jong-un is thinking about this election result? Does it give him any particular opportunities or influence his own strategy towards South Korea in any particular way?
I assume that Kim Jong-un is gloating right now because he really doesn't like Yoon. Yoon's taken a very hard stance on him. So aside from that, we haven't seen too much saber rattling from North Korea, not as much as we may have anticipated relative to previous elections. Kim Jong-un knew that the writing for his press. But I do think one area where North Korea may see this as a partial win for them is that we've seen President Yoon trying to also shift the rhetoric. I wouldn't say shift, but it's more about double down. He's doubled down on the rhetoric of unification. He now wants to tie that. I mean, none of this is new, but it's really the emphasis that he places on unification and associating it with liberal democracy, with freedom. And so he was taking unification in a different direction, which North Korea, of course, has now rejected unification with South Korea and treats said that they were going to treat South Korea as a foreign enemy state. But because of this election, because of the elections, I think it'll be harder for Yoon to get any wind behind, a lot of support behind the direction that he's taking this unification language outside of his very kind of conservative base. And so issues like North Korean human rights has been of deep interest to President Yoon. I think he wants to put more resources and budget into expanding human rights programs. But that's clearly something that the opposition may not be excited about. And so when it comes to things like passing budgets, that might fall to the wayside. So there are ways where, and in North Korea issues, at least in the way that President Yoon wanted to shape those issues, it may not materialize. And for Kim Jong-un, of course, to have South Koreans talking less about human rights is better for his regime.
Yeah, so, I think it's safe to assume that Kim Jong-un is pleased by the outcome because he has more allies in the progressive South Korean base. But, and as much as he might want to try to influence domestic elections in the South, it's pretty clear that he cannot anymore because South Korean voters care about domestic issues and not foreign policy issues when they both vote for in the general elections and presidential elections. But I wouldn't be surprised if Pyongyang is still preparing for South Korea's upcoming 2027 presidential election, and coming up with some sort of game plan, depending on who wins that election. But for the time being, I just don't see the North interested in engaging the conservative Yoon government, let alone, of course, we're seeing that it's not interested in engaging the Biden administration. And so, we may expect, of course, again, short of any unexpected variables that we can't see right now that are unforeseen now in for the future, North Korea might just continue to stay its course, and it perhaps will be business as usual for North Korea to continue to test weapons, and to continue to further advance their nuclear weapons capability.
Okay, one quick follow-up on that particular issue. While South Korea was consumed with its national elections, of course, President Biden was hosting Prime Minister Kishida, and it kind of seems that some signals were being sent, once again, about engagement with North Korea. President Biden endorsing Prime Minister Kishida's efforts to possibly even have a summit with Kim Jong-un. Do you see any risk? Do you think that anything's going to happen there? And how do you think the Yoon administration is likely to respond to that development?
Well, I thought that North Korea had recently rejected that idea of having some kind of summit with Japan, and even like having the soccer match in Pyongyang. I don't know if it was the men's team or the women's team, but they decided not to do that. So we may still be a long ways away before we see a Japan North Korea summit. So I don't see it in the works anytime soon. But what that would mean for Yoon, I think, because there's this trilateral relationship and that there's open lines of communication. We remember from the Camp David summit, the commitment to consult. I think there would be an understanding from Yoon of why they would want to have possibly try to engage North Korea on this front, since nothing is happening on the diplomatic front, and this might generate new energy or can restart some kind of discussions with the North Koreans. And so I think Yoon, even though he's fairly hard line on North Korea, might be amenable to that prospect. But again, I feel like Kim Yo-jong, Kim Jong-un's sister, made that suggestion, and then it seems like North Korea has decided to rethink whether they would want to meet the Japanese.
Yeah, that's been my reading too. And so I don't expect that to happen anytime soon. But if it were to happen, then of course on North Korea's terms, and perhaps one of motivation for North Korea could be to try to drive wedges among America's allies and partners. But I think traditionally we would think that there might be concerns from South Korea about a Japan-North Korea meeting or a summit. But again, like Andrew said, so far the trilateral U.S., South Korea, Japan trilateral cooperation and coordination consultation is going on strong, and so I would expect the three countries to continue to share notes and to be transparent with each other about each other's intentions when they're engaging with North Korea.
Okay, great. We've got a number of really good questions from our audience. I want to start with a question from Tom Ramage. And he's asking, he notes that opposition party leader Lee Jae-myung got a lot of flack from meeting with the Chinese ambassador last year. And he's noting that there is news about a Japan-Korea-China trilateral. And so do you think that the election result is going to have any impact on the prospect of actually achieving a CJK, or I guess it depends on which country you're in, which order you put it in. But do you think that the trilateral summit between China, Korea, and Japan will get back on track, hosted by South Korea?
I do think so. In fact, I saw a news brief somewhere that they were supposed to hold it in late May. So they now have I don't know if they have a specific date, but this is something that the Yoon Suk-yeol government seems to have wanted, that they've been pushing for this for at least the last 6 months. And part of this is related to Yoon's global pivotal state, the idea that South Korea can convene these meetings, that they can engage with not just the US and Japan, but they also want to engage with China as well. So of course, their relationship with China is more contentious than it is with the United States. But because I think the opposition is they also want to see China engaging, or excuse me, Korea engaging China. In fact, Lee Jae-myung has been criticizing Yoon for, unnecessarily provoking the Chinese by aligning very tightly with the U.S., considering export controls as well. It'd be very hard for the opposition to oppose Yoon hosting the trilateral. The only thing they might say, just because they try to find any way to criticize Yoon, will say that, well, this is going to be a nothing burger. Nothing's going to really come out, nothing significant at least, with the China, Japan, Korea trilateral. But it would be difficult for them to oppose it because they themselves want to see improved relations between South Korea and China.
Duyeon?
Yeah, I mean, basically what Andrew said. And this also, goes back to my earlier comment about a potential Japan-North Korea meeting. I think the U.S. South Korea, Japan trilateral relationship is strong enough right now. And of course, it sounds like the Biden administration completely understands the reasons and supports why South Korea would be interested in hosting a China, Korea, Japan trilateral summit. And so, sure, we've seen, I think the news reports were coming out of Japan first about reviewing potential dates in late May for a potential summit in Seoul. But it's a tricky and sensitive matter. I think there are still some variables involved, and so I think I'll believe it when I actually see an official statement coming out of South Korea that it's actually going to happen. It's certainly in the interest of all three countries for them to have a trilateral summit, even though we're seeing intensifying relations between democratic countries and autocratic countries. But there are national interests here at stake that make it beneficial for all three countries to meet, despite the geopolitics and the geostrategic environment. And so Yeah, I'll believe it after. I'll believe it when I see it, I think, for this trilateral summit.
Okay. And then we also have a question from David Gossick, really about the political dynamics of the climate change issue in South Korea, and whether or not I guess the election complicates or not issues like pursuing greenhouse gas reduction targets or South Korea's hydrogen roadmap policy. Do you see the two sides as aligned or likely to disagree over South Korea's climate change efforts?
Well, the first thing I want to say, Scott, is that your colleague Troy is probably the best equipped person to answer this question when it comes to hydrogen. But since he's not here, I mean, both the progressives and the conservatives, they are committed to reducing carbon emissions to meeting climate change goals. I think the opposition, the Democratic Party of Korea, is probably more forward leaning on this front. I'm not exactly sure where their stance is on the hydrogen, particularly, but the one area where there is a divergence is on their approach to nuclear energy. And I think we've seen Yoon Suk-yeol has been very bullish when it comes to including nuclear within the mix of clean energy. And of course, as a foreign policy issue, he's really been trying to sell South Korean nuclear reactors or push Korea to become, one of the leaders in nuclear energy. There's a deal with the UAE, and then, of course, with Saudi Arabia, there's a lot of conversations. But that's something that the opposition, the Democratic Party of Korea, has been opposed to. Moon Jae-in had moved in the opposite direction. He was trying to reduce the amount of reduce the number of nuclear reactors in South Korea. So that's something that could bring headwinds to Yoon's policy when it comes to the use of nuclear energy and that mix and reducing carbon emissions. But I'll pass it on to Duyeon to see if she has anything in addition.
Okay, another question that we have, this is more of a specific, I guess, a factual question related to the election outcome. Why did the Green/Justice Party lose all of their seats? And I personally think that is primarily related to the emergence of the Choeguk Party.
Yeah.
Which squeezed the Justice Party on the PR. And then I believe, I'm not sure if this is correct, but I believe that Shin Sang-jong actually had run last time in a district and won. And I guess that, and I know she ran again and did not win that district.
Yeah, she didn't even get half the votes. And Scott, actually, I think you invited her, or she came by CFR once when you were there. I don't know, but I remember meeting her in Washington, but she's been around politics for a long time, rebranded in different parties of the kind of far left progressive. But I mean, I think the easy explanation is just the Choeguk Party, and then her party was crowded out. But I also think it's a change in the way that maybe the progressive party or the progressive wing has been moving in South Korea. I mean, in some ways, she's kind of the old guard of what the far left was, but perhaps politics has moved on, and so voters are looking to see a different. I mean, I think the issues are perhaps changing, and we did see the rise of this rebuilding party of Korea that garnered 12 votes. So yeah, but it's yeah. So her political career is over, and we'll have to see the.
Well, she's announced that she's resigning from she's retiring from politics.
I also heard there was some internal. I don't know what the internal issues were, but in following that story, it seemed like there was also some internal issues within the Green Justice Party. My assumption is there were probably issues about how next to move forward in this political landscape, and maybe there were some internal divisions as well.
So I have another question. We're coming down to the end of our time, but this is really, I think, in some ways more of a hypothetical question. But there is a question about what would the opposition party's position and policy toward North Korea be in the context of Kim Jong-un's recent shift on unification and declaring South Korea the main enemy, really dismantling all of the unification-focused institutions. It seems that really challenges the main progressive plank of the platform toward North Korea, focused on reconciliation, if your counterpart really doesn't want to talk to you? Or do you think that would be reversed in the event that the progressives come back into power?
I think the circumstance, well, first, Kim Jong-un can always reverse it if he wants to, but the circumstances for him to reverse it would really depend on what happens and what kind of approach a future progressive South Korean government takes. I don't think whenever the next progressive government is in office, if things are the way they are today, I don't think that they would scrap or try to redo or rewrite their policy toward North Korea on unification. I think there are, North Korea's statement about South Korea being its enemy and saying no to unification unless there's a contingency situation on the peninsula. I don't think they're actually scrapping unification policy entirely. It seems to be more of their way to justify their crackdown on North Korean people, because we've been seeing reports of increased South Korean cultural influence in North Korea, and so for Kim Jong-un to announce that South Korea is the enemy, it helps to justify further crackdown and strengthening of control of his own people. And so, I think he certainly has the powers to reverse them, to reverse that on a dime. But again, I think the circumstances would have to be right for him, and he might actually wait and see what kind of approach a future progressive South Korean government takes with him first.
I have a slightly different angle, because I think, the progressives are probably grieving to hear that Kim Jong-un no longer wants unification, but at the same time, well, first, they're going to criticize, I think, the conservatives, that it's because of Yoon Suk-yeol's policies, that's why we got to this point. But then second, I still think there's going to be room to work with North Korea, because the interpretation and the nuance of unification is different between progressives and conservatives. They both want to see a united Korea, a one Korea. But for progressives, they don't use the unification language as much as I think the conservatives. They like to focus on peace and engagement. And of course, they want unification, but because their emphasis is on the peace and the engagement part, I think their tact would be to try to restore the engagement part, to talk about peace and stability, and hopefully persuade the North Koreans that they might still want ultimately to come back to this goal of unification. So I think they'll just blame the progressives, the opposition. They'll blame the conservatives and the ruling party. But I think within that space, they could still talk about unification, but emphasizing the engagement, the peace and engagement part.
Okay, well, in the last minute, I have one last question that I'm giving exactly the amount of time that it probably deserves. And that is, do you think that the National Assembly election result would have any impact on President Yoon in the event that President Trump were to return to the White House?
Just a lot of noise if they don't like what Yoon is doing.
Yeah, I saw this coming. We can't end this without bringing in the Trump question, right, Scott? But yeah, it depends. Moon Jae-in actually worked quite well for a time being with Donald Trump during the summit. So yeah, it's hard to say. It depends on what context. It could go either they could be really concerned and make a stink, or they could try to make it work and see if they could restart engagement perhaps with North Korea. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
We really appreciate the discussion, and also please come to National Committee on North Korea website and YouTube channel for additional programs of this sort. Now I'm going to conclude the webinar now that I've made my PSA. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.